Excuse me, that came out of nowhere. Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm taking a look back at the Final Fantasy franchise. This will be my Final Fantasy retrospective. I'll be talking a little bit about the franchise, the evolution of the games, some history, and also my personal experiences with Final Fantasy as a game series. So, I'll start with the history side of things first. Final Fantasy has kind of a rocky history. It was originally being developed by Squaresoft before they were bought out and then bought out again. The company was not doing well financially, and that's the reason why it's called Final Fantasy, is because they expected it was going to be their last game. Nintendo interfered, or not interfered, but interceded. Nintendo stepped in and saved the game and helped them bring it to North America and help it find a new audience. And the game was a success in Japan. Not a massive success, but enough of a success. Square was able to get the funding to make more Final Fantasy games and then eventually other games. Eventually, they would pretty much just become the house that makes Final Fantasy games. Now, as you all know, in this channel, in these types of videos, I usually don't talk about what goes on in Japan. I focus mostly on what happened in America because I grew up in North America and that's what I'm familiar with. And that's not going to be any different here. Final Fantasy II was an early title for the Super NES. Was actually Final Fantasy IV, the fourth game in the series, but because 2 and 3 were NES, or Famicom, I should say, exclusives, they were never localized for North America. What we got was known as Final Fantasy II, was actually Final Fantasy IV. The same thing would happen with Final Fantasy V, and then we got Final Fantasy VI, rebranded as Final Fantasy III. So if you ever hear an American gamer talk about Final Fantasy III, we're usually referring to what the Japanese would call 6. But I'm not going to clarify. When I say Final Fantasy III, I mean 6, but I mean 3 isn't what we had in the U.S. Because I don't read Japanese, so I can't play the Japanese games, so they don't count. They don't exist in my world. Now, Final Fantasy II was more or less a one-off. Nobody remembers it. Nobody played it. It wasn't a big hit. But Final Fantasy III was their big one. This was the one they put all their resources behind and all the marketing. The magazines and Nintendo and Square and everybody was pushing this as the next big game. This was the game that was going to make people, finally make people who were on the fence about playing JRPGs. This was the game that was going to convince them to play JRPGs. And it worked. Because I had already played Phantasy Star 4 on the Sega Genesis, and by the time I got my Super Nintendo, I had already read magazine articles about how great this game was supposed to be, so I ended up buying a copy of it on the SNES. We'll come back to that when I get into the personal side of the video. Well, things got complicated from here. Because up to this point, Squaresoft and Nintendo had a pretty good partnership. But they had a bit of a falling out between 6 and 7. Or 3 and 7. Which I know was confusing going from 3 to 7. But we figured it out eventually. And ultimately what happened, and I'm going to kind of skip over some of this stuff. Final Fantasy VII was initially in development for the Nintendo 64. But due to the limitations of the cartridges, Sony approached Squaresoft with an offer to make the game for the PlayStation. And gave them a whole bunch of money to making it exclusive. They would help them localize it and publish it and whatnot, and then it would be a big deal in the US, or at least help them market it. It would be a big deal for the PlayStation, which it was. Final Fantasy VII was the biggest fucking game on the PlayStation. It was tremendously popular, and it was the game that actually succeeded at bringing in non-JRPG gamers into the fold, where 3 had tried, 7 has succeeded. Final Fantasy VII was kind of a double-edged sword, though. The game was tremendously popular, but it had a self-contained story. You know, it had an ending that was satisfying and tied up all the loose ends. But because the game was so popular, there was a subset of gamers. We're going to skip over the side games. We're not talking about the mystics, quests, and tactics and all that bullshit. We're just talking about the mainline games. But what happened was they released Final Fantasy VIII, which also had tremendous hype. But people were disappointed because it had nothing to do with Final Fantasy VII, and it didn't look anything or play anything like Final Fantasy VII. And so people started to figure out that Final Fantasy was not an ongoing series. It was just a series of games unrelated to one another that just shared the same name. And this was kind of a turnoff for a lot of people, so 8 didn't do as well as 7. And then 9 came out and didn't even do as well as 8. So the games were starting to get divisive. But 7 was successful enough at bringing in new gamers into the JRPG scene and new gamers into the Final Fantasy fold that they were still able to continue the series and find success. And they would eventually grow into even more successful as time went on. Releasing Final Fantasy X really early in the PS2's life really helped push the PS2 into the stratosphere, which it would go on to be the best-selling game console of all time, which it still holds that record to this day, over 20 years later. And over 10 years after it had been discontinued. So, yeah. X got an immediate sequel known as X2, which was, I think, the first time a Final Fantasy game got a sequel that was set in the same timeline with the same characters. Now, there would be some spin-off games in the Final Fantasy VII series that would go on for a while, even an animated movie that was theatrically released, if I'm not mistaken. So 7 would become its own franchise, for better or worse. I would say worse, but whatever. And then Nintendo, really wanting to get Final Fantasy back on their home consoles, made a deal with Squaresoft, or now Square Enix at the time. And they were able to get a spin-off game which would sort of become its own franchise briefly on Nintendo consoles, known as Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. But this didn't last long, and the game was a mess. Let's just leave it at that. I loved it, don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic game, but it's complicated and I don't want to get into it today. I'll do a whole video on Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, and I'm going to do a whole separate video on the GameCube, and everything good about the GameCube and everything wrong with the GameCube. But let's push that aside for a second. Then they made their first attempt at an MMO, also on the PS2, Final Fantasy XI. This one was not a massive success because you had to have the hard drive to be able to play the game, and you had to have the network adapter to be able to play the game, and not everybody had those two peripherals. And later models of the PS2 weren't even compatible with the hard drive. So it was a game you could only play if you had a very specific model of PS2, which, you know, as the generation went on and sales shifted to the, you know, slimmer models that were not compatible with the hard drive, that game became unplayable. And because the servers are gone and everything else, that game's unplayable today in its originally intended form. So that's what we classify as a dead game. Unfortunately, there's a bunch of those in the online era, which is one of the drawbacks to online games. So they repackaged and rebranded and tried again with Final Fantasy XII, which would be the last mainline Final Fantasy game released exclusively to Sony consoles. Final Fantasy XII would be released on the PS2, and kind of a swan song for the PS2, at least for Square Enix and Final Fantasy gamers. because they migrated. Final Fantasy 13 went to next-gen consoles, and as the first game in the series that was in HD, it was released on the Xbox 360 and the PS3, and was pretty successful all the way around. And then we got to Final Fantasy 14, which was their second attempt at an MMO. This time released for Windows computers or PCs. I guess it may be playable on Mac and other systems. I don't know, but we'll just say computers. It was not released for home consoles. This one, because it was more accessible, was a little bit more successful. Not initially. It had some bumps in the road, but eventually they would fix the bugs and things and issues, and it would grow into a phenomenon and find its user base, and it's still going strong to this day. By the time it came to do Final Fantasy 15, they had already branched off into multiple spin-offs, including a whole separate series of Disney-themed spin-off Final Fantasy games known as Kingdom Hearts. That's a whole separate video. And then the last, or at least most recent, mainline Final Fantasy game was Final Fantasy 15, released for the PS4 and Xbox One family of consoles. We have not had a new Final Fantasy mainline game for the current gen consoles, PS5, Xbox Series, etc. Allegedly, Final Fantasy 16 is in development, but we're pretty late in the console life cycles for a Final Fantasy game to be coming out, which is unusual for Final Fantasy games. They usually come out earlier in the console life cycle than this. Unfortunately, with the transition to high-definition graphics and eventually 4K and bigger hard drives, bigger worlds and things like that, it now takes longer to make a game of this scale and to be able to make it, where it's actually compelling, whereas Final Fantasy 15 was referred to mockingly by fans as, Road Trip the video game. This isn't necessarily fair, because once you get past the road trip portions of the game, it becomes a Final Fantasy game. But this was the same kind of criticism that was lobbed at Final Fantasy VIII, which was basically, college campus, the video game, before it turned into a Final Fantasy game. So yeah, there are some criticisms of the Final Fantasy games. Not every one of them is going to be a hit, and not every game's going to be for everybody. Now let's get into my personal history. I started by renting Final Fantasy III for the Super NES shortly after I got my Super Nintendo. I had already had a Sega Genesis for a couple of years. I had already rented and played quite a bit of Phantasy Star 4. I was already knee-deep in the Legend of Zelda games. I had already started playing Dungeons & Dragons, not only the tabletop game, role-playing game with my friends, but also playing computer games like Legend of Dark Moon, Eye of the Beholder, Pool of Radiance, and a few others. So I was already well-versed in role-playing games, computer games. But Final Fantasy was different. It was, I know technically Phantasy Star 4 was also a JRPG, but Final Fantasy III was nothing like Phantasy Star. It was a completely different experience, and it was good. I loved it. But because I only rented it for a weekend, I didn't get to get very far in the game. And I wasn't able to rent it again because it was a hot property, and it got rented out quite a bit. Now, in 1996, I rented another Squaresoft Nintendo collaboration, which was a Final Fantasy video game with Mario characters known as Super Mario RPG, and I really loved that game. That was a fairly accessible JRPG for someone who wasn't really well versed in Japanese RPGs. Because they are different than Western style RPGs, which I was more used to. And more of a fan of. I do like some good JRPGs, don't get me wrong. But they don't always do it for me. When I did get a PlayStation 1 in 2000 for my 18th birthday, Final Fantasy VII was the very first game I bought for it. And it was the it game to play. The first JRPG, or role-playing video game of any kind, for that matter, that I ever beat. I was so committed to Final Fantasy VII that not only did I beat it, but on my immediate after I beat it, I started a second playthrough the very next day. And on my second playthrough, not only was I determined to beat it again, this time I was determined to beat it 100%, meaning I wanted to beat both of the optional bosses, and I wanted to get all of the materials at max level, and get the Knights of the Round and all that good stuff. So, this time, I got the strategy guide, and I went through the game, and I did everything. I unlocked all the secrets, I got everything at 100% of the game. I have replayed Final Fantasy VII to 100% 3 separate times. Once on the Windows PC version of the game, and again on the PS3, the Final Fantasy VII PS1 digital download that I bought off of the PSN store. And I beat it again. So I have beat Final Fantasy VII 4, maybe 5 times in my life, and 100% at least 3 times of those. I really like this game. It's not only my favorite PS1 game, it's my favorite JRPG of all time, and it's in my top 10 favorite video games of all time. It's actually my number 2 favorite video game of all time, right behind Super Mario World. Anyways, I lost my train of thought. But because I was so enamored by Final Fantasy VII, and PlayStation was still popular at the time, and PS2 had just come out, and it was very expensive, I went ahead and got Final Fantasy VIII, because I was like everybody else expecting a game like Final Fantasy VII. And I was immediately disappointed, but as I played through the game, it started to grow on me. But then something happened. I'm not going to spoil the game. But something happened midway through the game that made me stop playing it cold turkey. And I was like, nope, not going to happen. And I quit. So I never got very far in Final Fantasy VIII. I would pick up Final Fantasy 9 years later as a retro purchase that I would pick up later after I was already knee-deep in the GameCube era. After I had played Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles on the GameCube, which was... I had mixed feelings about. It was exciting and interesting and fun, but it was also a disappointment. Briefly, the problem with Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is what made it unique is it was a 4-player Final Fantasy game, which is interesting. The problem is you have to have 4 Game Boy Advance systems with Game Boy Advance link cables to play at 4-player. And you have to have a GBA and a link cable to play the game, period. It was mandatory, not optional. So that was obnoxious. So the game is hella fucking expensive. Back in the day it was expensive, today it's expensive. It's just obnoxiously expensive to play Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles as it was originally designed to be played. Which is a turnoff for people, obviously. And the game can't very well accurately be emulated on modern emulators because you can't really emulate the GBA connectivity experience on a laptop. So the game is basically unplayable unless you've got thousands of dollars to spend on it, which is obnoxious. So then I discovered Final Fantasy IX. I did not get into that game at all. I started it. I played it for maybe an hour or less, and I decided it wasn't working. Years later, and I mean a decade more later, 2013, right after they discontinued... No, 2014. A year after they discontinued the PS2. I got my first PS2 in September of 2014. Immediately after that, I got a Nintendo Wii U, which was my then current gen game console. In November of that year, Black Friday to be specific, I would get a PS4. But I would also end up getting a PS3 around that same time. So now I had 3 PlayStation consoles, and technically 4 because the PS2 and the PS3 are both backwards compatible with PS1. So I was still able to play some PS1 games. And as I was exploring PS1 games and I was playing games on the PS2 for the first time, the very first game I got for PS2 was Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy 12. Those were the first 2 games I got. I never played X2 because I didn't get into X. And I got pretty far into 12, but eventually I got bored and lost interest, which is going to be a common theme with later Final Fantasy games for me. None of them captured the magic of 7. And this is where I have to pause the video for just a minute because my headache is getting unbearable, so I got to take some Tylenol. I'll be right back. So this is where things are going to kind of wrap up, because I skipped 11, obviously. It wasn't playable. And I did play a little bit of 13 on the PS3. I couldn't get into it. I tried. I played a little bit of 15 on the PS4. Again, I couldn't get into it. And I tried Final Fantasy 14 on the PC and also just lost interest. It was just another boring MMO. Nothing special. So that's where my Final Fantasy retrospective ends, because that's where I am today. I tried the remake of Final Fantasy VII, was not a fan. I have not tried any of the spin-offs other than like Tactics on the PS1 and Mystic, I think it's called Mystic Quest or something like that on the SNES. And I guess Crystal Chronicles and a couple of the Crystal Chronicles spin-offs on the Wii. I had a couple of those. They were okay. Nothing special. Crystal Chronicles was a pretty good game, pretty fun game. It just had a high barrier of entry. And it's just not very playable today. So that's annoying. Anyways, that's all I have on Final Fantasy. So let me know which ones did you play. Stay cool.